Alright, so let's talk about the small intestine. This is the gastroduodenal junction. We have the lumen up here. On the left side of the slide, we have the end of the pylorus. And on the right side, this is the start of the duodenum. Let's talk about the muscularis externa first. So you can see here it's much wider over here than it is over here. And that's because this is the pyloric sphincter. In the pyloric sphincter, there's a lot more smooth muscle in the inner circular layer than there is on the outer longitudinal layer. You can see the separation between the two here with the myenteric plexus in between. And now that we're moving into the small intestine, we only have two layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis externa, the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer, whereas the stomach had three. There's a section of the slide that stains more darkly eosinophilic over here. I think that's just an artifact. This is all still the smooth muscle of the muscularis externa. Yeah, you can even see here stains a little darker than these cells over here, even though they're the same. So let's talk about that next. Just past the muscularis externa, we have the submucosa. And you can see that submucosa is dominated by these Brunner's glands. They secrete mucus and bicarb, and you need a ton of them here to neutralize the acidity of the gastric contents. So I think these are Brunner's glands just like these. If you zoom in, you can see that the cells pretty much all look the same. They've got that white bubbly mucus appearance. So that's on the duodenal side. Let's look at the gastric side. So just to review, the stomach mucosal layer is made of gastric pits and then glands. And we're in the pylorus, so we have gastric pits up here, and these are the pyloric glands. And you can see the pits going into the gland over here. So over here, it looks like we're starting to pick up those Brunner's glands. There's not that many over here, but as you're moving to the right of the slide, and you're getting closer to the duodenum, you're getting more and more of these Brunner's glands. Now, unfortunately, on this slide, we don't really see the villi all too well, because in the duodenum, you would expect to see villi, right? I don't know why you don't see them too well here. You would expect to see them look kind of like this. But another way you can tell that you're in the duodenum and no longer in the stomach is if you zoom in, you start seeing goblet cells. And you don't expect to see any goblet cells in the stomach epithelium. So if we go over here in the stomach, these are all just mucus secreting cells. You don't see that those interspersed goblet cells like you do in the small intestine and the colon. And this area over here, well, it doesn't look like the Brunner's glands, right? They stain more darkly. But it looks like a simple columnar epithelium. These look like they could be goblet cells. Here's another one. So that would make this the lamina propria. So I think this is actually just a piece of the mucosal layer similar to up here. You can see they stain very similarly. It's just a strange section that you're getting over here. All right, and let's move on to the next slide of the duodenum. So in this slide, you can much better appreciate the architecture of the villi and the Crypts of Lieberkuhn. And remember that villi are only going to be found in the small intestine. So if we look at this cartoon drawing, if you were to walk along here, which is what Dr. Kramer would call the ground level, you'd see these villi popping up, and then these crypts that are going down, which are kind of like holes in the ground. So if you compare that to the gastric mucosa, these are just kind of holes in the ground that would go all the way down. So we have the epithelium over here. Here are your villi. And these are going into the crypts of Lieberkuhn right here. So remember that even though these don't look like they're connecting to the lumen, that they have to connect somehow, otherwise they can't get their contents out to the lumen. You can actually see on this side here, this villus is over here, and the crypt goes all the way down to the base where the Paneth cells are. In addition, these are the Brunner's glands that we saw in the previous slide. And you can see that they also dump their contents through a duct system into the base of the crypt. So these are Brunner's glands in the longitudinal section, and they're dumping their contents here. You can see another connection of Brunner's glands with the base of a crypt over here. So let's zoom out and talk about the layers for a second. Here we've got the epithelium. You see the lamina propria. It's full of leukocytes. Looks like here is the muscularis mucosa layer. And you see lots of Brunner's glands. Some of it's actually in the mucosal layer, but mostly in the submucosa down here. And if we zoom out even more, we'll see that the muscularis externa is deeper inside. We have the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer. And we have the nerve plexuses in between. So there are two cells that we have to pay particular attention to on this slide because they stain really well. At the base of the crypt, as we mentioned before, we have Paneth cells, where their very pink granules are towards the apical side of the cell. And these contain antimicrobial material such as lysozyme. And the other cell that we're looking for are the Enteroendocrine cells. It looks like here's an example of one. The granules will be on the basal side of the cell. So let's see if we can find a few more. Maybe. That could be one right there. I'm not confident about that one though. This looks like another one. As well as here, you can also see that it stains a little more pale as well. And make sure you remember that the enteroendocrine cells, it's not really one kind of cell. It's a class of cells that includes the G cells and secrete gastrin, I cells, K cells, S cells secrete secretin, etc. I think I just saw another one over here. And now let's move on to the jejunum. So on the slide of the jejunum, just be careful with it because there is a lot of artifact on this slide. See these darkened areas over here? The tissue just folded over itself. You see it in the epithelium as well. And in addition, you might be, on first glance, be tempted to think this is the lumen over here because it's kind of encirculating this way. The lumen's actually out on this side because that's where the epithelium is. Now, if we take a closer look, first of all, we know that we're no longer in the duodenum because we don't see the Brunner's gland in the submucosa anymore. These are all blood vessels over here and collagen. So if we look at the mucosal layer, we've got the muscularis mucosa over here. Here's the lamina propria. Got some crypts of Lieberkuhn in cross-section and in the longitudinal section. More lamina propria. So here are the villi. And here's the epithelium with lots of goblet cells. You might notice there are more goblet cells here than the duodenum. And that's what you would expect because as you go further distally, you're going to get more and more goblet cells. So we have villi in longitudinal section. We also see some in a cross section. Let's see, there's some better ones over here, I think. Yeah. And like in the previous slide, we see the Paneth cells again. It's a lot harder to find the enteroendocrine cells on this slide. So I think we'll just be expected to see them on the other one. And something on this slide that you can appreciate really well is how the small intestine increases surface area. So remember back in high school and college biology where the answer to every science multiple choice question was increased surface area? Well, that's kind of what's happening in the small intestine. Here's one of the Plicae circularis, this outfolding of almost like the submucosal sticking out this way, pushing out the epithelium to increase surface area this way. Each villus itself is another way to increase surface area. And then the third level of it is when you zoom all the way in, and I mean, I'm at the max right now. You can barely see this fuzz at the end of the epithelium. It's called the brush border. That also increases surface area. Let's see if we can see it better, a different part. Yeah, it's pretty tough to see here. I don't think there's enough resolution, but just know that the tiny little microvilli will be at the edge of the epithelial cells. And in terms of the epithelium itself, it's mostly composed of two kinds of cells. We have the goblet cells, and the rest are mostly going to be enterocytes that do most of the absorbing. And you have some occasional intraepithelial lymphocytes as well. The manual does say to look for the myenteric plexus for this slide. So to look for that, first let's establish our muscular layers of the muscularis externa. So this is the outer longitudinal layer, and this is the inner circular layer. So we'd expect to find myenteric plexus or Auerbach's plexus in between. And here we have it. And if we keep moving along in between the two layers, we'll see even more of these nerve plexuses. Another structure that the manual points out is the central lacteal, and that's this yellow structure here. It'll be in the lamina propria along with blood vessels and lymphocytes. And they're a little tough to find. They tend to collapse. But I think I found one here. You can see the squamous epithelium of the lacteal. Looks like there might be a couple of red blood cells in it, which you really wouldn't expect. But it's definitely not as many red blood cells as, for example, these blood vessels over here. And finally, let's talk about the last slide for the small intestine, the ileum. So here's the intestine over here, the epithelium over here. This is the lumen. And these structures right here are Peyer's patches. And this is how you know you're in the ileum. These are large aggregates of lymphocytes. So if you scroll in, these are all lymphocytes. For the epithelium itself and mucosal layer, we see some cross sections of villi. And these are longitudinal sections of villi. And these are the crypts down here. Just deep to that is a very thin muscular mucosa and the submucosa, where the Peyer's patches are. And deep to that, here's your muscularis externa, inner circular layer, outer longitudinal layer. Looks like these are kind of cross-section, and these are longitudinal. One trick that Dr. Kramer did point out is in order to tell how your slide is oriented, if you look at the outer longitudinal layer, if in the cross-section, that means the slide is in cross-section. Let's take a closer look at the epithelium. You can see there's a lot more goblet cells here compared to the jejunum or the duodenum. And if we look at the crypts then here, even these look like it's mostly mucus-secreting cells. Here's a muscularis mucosa. Lamina propria is out over here. This looks like submucosa with it's probably collagen, connective tissue. Here's some smooth muscle. And your nerve plexus. It looks like these might be Meissner's plexuses over here. So just to summarize, if you see villi, goblet cells, and crypts of Lieberkuhn, then you know you're in the small intestine. And if you're trying to figure out where in the small intestine you are, just look in the submucosa. In the submucosa, if you see Peyer's patches, you're in the ileum. If you see Brunner's glands, then you're in the duodenum. If you see neither of the two, then you're in the jejunum. All right, and that's it for this video. So happy hunting, good luck.